Comments, the situation is getting right out of hand here. This meeting was devised with a title which would keep people away. All the discussions with Peter Alexander produced the most boring title. Wouldn't go anywhere better to get a boring title, and we got the most boring title. And we could work out over many days in order that people should not come and go to the other important meetings which are on here today. And therefore, I think there's going to be a lot of disappointment and disarray, because it is, what we're dealing with here is a history lesson. And as you know, the history is very, very boring. It's also very, very simple. The way in which it's taught in our schools and colleges and universities is really quite straightforward, and that is that there arise from time to time men, usually men, sometimes women, but men who are greater than other men, and they determine by their ingeniousness and their intelligence and their brilliance of one kind or another what happens in society. And if you're asking the question, how is it that we are in this extraordinary situation, that we live in a society in which everything that we do, wherever we work, or wherever we live, all our endeavours in one way or another are governed by entirely hierarchical, oligarchical, bossy and undemocratic organisations. We're told what to do. Some people who are lucky are appointed to tell other people what to do, and the people who are told what to do don't have any choice in the matter whatever. That's the general rule of society. And how it is that once every 5 years, or if you're really lucky every 4 years, as has been the case recently, there suddenly comes a time when everybody is interested in what you think and what you're going to decide, and you're suddenly very important for about 3.5 weeks. Your view is being solicited by people on the doorsteps who you never want to see again. Suddenly, a matter of choice is oversized for the populace at large of democracy. If you want to ask how it is we arrive at this extraordinary situation where these things happen, of course you'll be told in the history books that it is the result of great men. And since we have here the elite of the masses intelligentsia in Britain, there's no need for me to really test you very much. I mean, for instance, if I was to ask the question, who here has heard of William Ewart Gladstone? And everybody was honest about it. A forest of hands would go up across the room. Everybody's heard of Gladstone. You know who he was. He was Prime Minister for about 100 years. For about 150 years. A wonderfully brilliant speaker with huge oratorical gestures. He had a habit of putting his hand like that. It was always remarked on by people who went to Parliament. He was a man with a tremendous conscience. He was constantly being dogged by his conscience. He had a great sense of guilt about other people who haven't got as much as he had. Awful lot. Really a sanctimonious old windbag. He represented property. That's who he represented. I want to get this size clear in this matter. And he's the first great man we're dealing with here tonight. W.E. Gladstone. Then if I was to ask the question, who here has heard of Benjamin Disraeli? Then everyone would say, oh yes, we've heard of him. He was Prime Minister for about 100 years. In Parliament, he was a brilliant chap. He was a novelist. He wrote books not just about the class from which he came, or the class that he was interested in assisting. He wrote books about the working class. He even used the expression. He wrote a book called Sybil, which was called Sybil, or the Two Nations, the first half of which is all about some patrician fellow who falls upon the workers and finds out they're nothing quite as bad as his father told him they were. And even meets revolutionaries and gets interested in revolutionary politics. And then, of course, as all such people with any intelligence does, joins the Tory party and sorts the whole thing out. Intelligent, supple mind, cunning, whereas Gladstone had this conscience, Disraeli had more of this cunning, and he represented property, so that we get it quite clear which side we are. Gladstone and the Liberal Party for property, and Disraeli and the Tory Party for property. It doesn't really matter which particular aspect of property they represented property. Now, these two men got the vote for us. That's the history. That's history. Who got the vote? Gladstone, his conscience, and Disraeli and his cunning together combined across the floor of the House of Commons to get the vote for all of you. That's what everybody says in the history book. They thought it was a bit of a swizz. That the old 1832 Act only allowed people to vote who had £10 worth of property. That was about 800,000 of the population of about 21 million. That was a bit unfair, wasn't it? They thought they ought to extend that, and they're worried. Gladstone would lie awake at night worrying. A lot of people aren't voting for me, that's terrible. Disraeli would worry about it. They were getting concerned. These people were very concerned that these people, they sort of allocated the vote. That's really the end of elections, in fact. Worrying will come, That is really the history that we're taught in all our history books. That's what it's all about. In fact, if you read this wonderful book here, History of England, G.M. Trevelyan, that's on every single O-level list that's ever been made, isn't it? Same as houses. You want to read what this says at the end. It says, Disraeli could not keep control of the parliamentary situation on any other terms. He's talking about now the 1860s, the late 1860s, which is what I'm really addressing myself to here. But the Conservative government had no majority of its own, and the bulk of the Liberal Party was no longer willing to be put off with a mere instalment of reform. The advice of Queen Victoria. There's someone else now you should consider. You should be grateful to for the vote. Now, the advice of Queen Victoria was all in favour of a settlement on the question. Lord Derby, these are very important people. Lord Derby. He was young Stanley, the Rupert of debate. That's somebody who's worth remembering. The Rupert of debate. Wish we could hear him now. Taken a leading part in passing the first reform bill, was now quite prepared to dish the wings and to take a leap in the dark. So, Disraeli very ably settled the question and pacified the country by carrying a measure which, as finally amended, was much stronger than the bill which he and the Dolomites, which have regarded the commercial interests of the colony involved, which he and the Conservatives had thrown out. He and the Conservatives had thrown out the year before as being too strong. In other words, he did it. Disraeli did it. He did it. He suddenly thought, awfully bad luck on these chaps who can't vote. We weren't worried about the women now, but we'll just give the chaps the vote. And that's what happened. They did. 1867 reformed the bill, 1868 before 1866, the reform bill that passed in a couple of months. Went through the House of Lords like a wildfire. The House of Lords had resisted every single measure of reform for the last 30 years. It suddenly went through like wildfire. Just Disraeli thought it was a good idea, and of course Gladstone supported him. Couldn't do much else, since he was in opposition at the time. That's the way it happened. I won't sit down because I hear you laughing, and I think maybe there may be something more to this, except for this. This is a slightly interesting aspect of the matter. Now, that theory, of course, is the formal bourgeois historian writing about how things develop and the clash of great minds and the wonderful ideas that take place in Parliament and how the votes emerge, those sorts of things. One thing that worries me slightly sometimes is that the same theory, perhaps the other side of the coin, is sometimes something that you read about among what we might describe as super-revolutionaries, people who know it all, who know the type I mean. The vote was a bourgeois trick, wasn't it? A trick invented by these rapscallions, these scoundrels, these bourgeois bastards who fought at night. We'll give them a vote. I will shut them up. That's a clever idea. Can you what, William Ewart? Yes, Benjamin. Why don't we agree in the House of Commons to give them the vote, and that will shut them up? A clever idea. Maybe they haven't thought about it yet. When they do think about it, well, that'll be serious. But why don't we just what they might do sometime in the future and give them the vote. Of course, if you think that, then of course all voting and democracy, or parliamentary democracy, all those things really become a great pile on top of this massive bourgeois trick which was carried out in 1867. It follows from that view, which is Trevelyan, and the Trevelyanites that you find among super-revolutionaries take the same view. All is ready, he did it all himself by Gladstone. If that's true, then all voting is quite irrelevant, nothing to do with any of us. It's all a complete farce and absurdity, and we don't have to pay any attention to it at all, and if an election comes by, we don't have to really concern ourselves who's standing, what's going on. Don't have to involve ourselves in the fact that everybody around us seems to be interested in this election, that we ourselves, despite ourselves, seem to be interested in this election, that we ourselves scoffing and booing and hissing watch every bloody minute of television election takes place. We can leave all that on one side. Of course, it's all a great bourgeois trick. So, is this right? I mean, it could be right. Trevelyan could be right, and the supers could be right. They could be right together, as so often they could join hands and, in their own irrelevance, shout at each other across a stage from which no one can hear them. That could be the case. However, let us see if this is the case, and then perhaps we can be a little better informed about it. Now, 1832, of course, was tremendous agitation to get the first reform bill through Parliament. Great big agitation, but very little result, as the Canaanite thing. £10 property, people could vote, as I say, but by 1832 it was about 500,000. By the time we got to 1867, it grown to about 800,000. Of a population which was in 1832 about 16 million, in 1867 about 20 million. So, that's the total population. Remember, we're not here talking at all about women. Women don't even get the vote. Half the population we're talking about, women don't even get the vote until 1918 and afterwards. So, we're not even talking about women, so you have to halve all these figures to find out what proportion it is, and then take off, of course, all those children that are under 21 and so on. Still, the 1831 £10-pounders, these people who had £10 worth of property, were a very small proportion of the population who had the vote. And very quickly it was rumbled, if you like, by the working class. I spoke about this, it seems just yesterday at Sickness, so I'm not going to go into any great length again today. Very quickly it was rumbled with revolutionary movements in the working class, the Chartist movement. Chartists, by the way, for all the supers that are here, the Chartists were interested in getting the vote. That's what they wanted, the vote. They weren't really interested in all that much else in terms of the specific demands which they made. The 6 demands which they made were all related to the vote and the fairness of the vote and the fact that the result of the vote should meet regularly, the annual parliament, the only aspect of the Charter, incidentally, which doesn't get carried out. And they achieved the vote as a result of a massive revolutionary agitation right throughout the country. 1839, a great year of revolution in our history, not really mentioned in these history books at all. A tremendous year of revolution in which there was the possibility of what the Chartists called the Grand National Holiday, the general strike, the cessation of work, in which all the workers in the country, particularly those in the north where it was especially strong, would come out on strike and force the government to back down and grant the vote. And because it was such a strong agitation, it had to be broken by the other side. The ruling class couldn't put up with agitation of that kind. If agitation of that kind was successful, which carried with it all those notions of working class activity and working class self-government and so on, then really their whole class rule was threatened. And therefore it was that they fought the Chartists with everything at their disposal, all the way through from 1839 to 1848. 9 years of agitation, rising to great peaks in 1839, 1842, 1848, and fought all the time, not just fought in words, but fought also in deeds, and fought with militia being put in the right places at the right time. A tremendous amount of army movements going on, sometimes rather pessimistic about how much they could achieve. But at any rate, as the result of it, particularly ending in London here in 1848, the agitation broken and smashed with the Kennington demonstration held on the south of the river, unable to proceed across Parliament, and the whole great build-up of revolutionary activity over those 9 years completely subsides. Nothing was gained as a result of that agitation in terms of the votes, in terms of getting anything, and not only was nothing gained, but the stench of defeat which followed the 1848, the collapse of the 1848 agitation, the stench of defeat, and this is familiar to us, reached into every crevice of the movement. Everywhere where there were workers organised, there were workers less well organised. Everywhere where there had been socialists, there were suddenly no socialists. The Chartists, the joke was, the Chartist leaders all became managers of the local insurance societies and building societies. And you had a period which followed the 1848 defeat of the Chartists, a period of nearly 20 years we're talking about, which was almost interminable downturn. Doesn't mean there weren't all kinds of things going on and all kinds of agitation going on, but interminable downturn in our modern phraseology. The politics was left almost entirely to these two great parties, bombasting at one another. Lord Palmerston, the great Whig, reasserts the powers of the Whigs over the Liberal Party, the Liberal Party grovelling to the old reactionary imperialists in their number, and the Tories becoming even more reactionary in the process. One reactionary government following another reactionary government, and politics seemed to be about that. And in the process, certain amount of economic growth, 3% of growth every year during this period. It seemed to be almost uninterrupted. All kinds of things like the Great Exhibition, with all the wonderful chauvinism of empire added to the atmosphere of reaction and backwardness. And from time to time in this period, these great parliamentarians did have their bouts of conscience about the fact that they were elected by only a tiny percentage of the population. Typical example, since I know there are many Gladstonians here, a typical example is here in 1864, a Liberal from Yorkshire, and that's probably quite a left-wing Liberal from Yorkshire, comes down and moves an amendment to extend the franchise. Doesn't mean specific about it, just one of those silly things that happen in Parliament when people say, yes, have a good idea and talk about it. So they had a good idea and talked about it, and Gladstone answered for the government. And he worked himself up, Gladstone, if you read his speeches. It's terrible what you're forced to read from after them. Life of Gladstone by John Morley, try that one. When you read his speeches, you see how he works himself up into a talent or oratorical fury, tremendous rage. An idea gets hold of him and goes far beyond what he means to say. He said, I agree, we should extend the franchise. I lie awake in bed at night thinking about all these people who can't vote. It's appalling. I should walk the streets at night. Not after prostitutes, which some people said he did. I walk the streets at night worrying about the people who can't vote. I call upon the adversary to show cause. And I venture to say that every man who is not presumably incapacitated by some consideration of personal unfitness or of political danger is morally entitled to come within the pale of the Constitution. And then he really works himself up and he suddenly, oh my God, what have I said? Of course, in giving utterance to such a proposition, I do not recede from the protest I have previously made against sudden or violent or excessive or intoxicating change. Well, the moral position is quite clear, but you know we must remember that we're not saying anything too excessive. And when Palmerston, who's about to die, but even on his deathbed, could recognise the revolutionary statement that everyone had a moral right to play a part in the government in which they operated. Palmerston wrote, he said, you really get on board with the doctrine of universal suffrage, which I can never accept. I entirely deny that every sane and not disqualified man has a moral right to vote. I use that expression instead of the pale of the Constitution because I hold that all who enjoy the security of civil rights which the Constitution provides are within its pale. What every man and woman has a right to is to be well governed by me. Sorry, I just have to say like and they who propose to change or to show that the present organisation does not accomplish those objects. So Palmerston read to him, and Gladstone quickly read back. I'm at a loss to know how, as you have read my speech, you can ascribe this opinion to me as is universal suffrage. My declaration is taken generally, that all persons ought to be admitted to the franchise who can be admitted to it with safety. They're really conscience-sick liberal. After that, it's all right for me to say the word, as you know, was Gladstone changing his mind. 1866, when Gladstone was again, I think, Chancellor of the Exchequer, he tried again to introduce a bill to the House of Commons, smitten by his conscience, nothing else really, smitten by his conscience. He introduced a bill to the House of Commons which would lower that £10 limit that they had in 1832 to £7. Brilliant measure, which was introduced into the electorate. That's another 400,000 people. So you have 800,000 by the 1832 legislation, increased perhaps the very, very most by 400,000, which would be 1.2 million, which would still be about a tenth of the entitled electorate, of the total male electorate. But anyway, there it was, £7 franchise, we'll show we're willing, and we'll introduce it. And there was the most tremendous parliamentary opposition to this. There was a chap called Robert Lowe, who was a sort of Enoch Powell of his age, and just like Enoch Powell in another age, became extremely reactionary, really believed in the reaction, wasn't flexible at all in his reaction, absolutely devoted racist, imperialist and thug, who wasn't in any circumstances going to let anyone get the vote at any stage whatever. And he, just like Powell in later years, becomes terribly important at the time when he's convenient for the clubs for which he plans to speak, but when it isn't convenient, they forget about it. This time it was convenient. If you want venality, if you want ignorance, if you want drunkenness and facility for being intimidated, if on the other hand you want impulsive, unreflective and violent people, where do you look for them in the constituencies? You go to the top, or you go to the bottom? Well, I've got an answer for him, actually. It wasn't the answer that he was expecting. The answer was leading up to the fact that all those people at the bottom of society that he never meets are all disgusting, drunken lads, and you can't give them the vote. And Gladstone once again intervenes. These are our fellow subjects, our fellow Christians, our own flesh and blood. The problem is, somebody gets up and says, well, when the flesh and blood stop at £7? You've got £7 property, your flesh and blood, if you haven't, you're not flesh and blood. That's once again reasoning. Because an interesting feature of all in the debates on the 1866 legislation which was brought through, the £7 franchise, is renowned from Benjamin Disraeli. The £7 franchise would be a parliament of no statesmanship, no eloquence, no learning, no genius. Instead of these, you will have a horde of selfish and obscure mediocrities, incapable of anything but mischief, and that mischief devised and regulated by the raging demagogues of the hour. An exact description of Parliament in 1866, but not what he intended. Not intended to be an exact description of Parliament in 1866. But Disraeli was violently opposed to this little bit of change in increasing the franchise, and the Tories ganged up with the right wing in the Liberals. They were called the Dullamites, because they go to the cave of Adullam. John Bright called them Dullamites. The Tories lined up with the right wing in the Liberal Party to defeat the bill, and to defeat even this miserable little extension of the franchise. And as is occasionally happening all the time in the 20 or 30 years, they got terribly sulky, the Liberals, when they lost. You've beaten us in here. Oh well, we're going to resign. The Queen had resigned. The Queen begged him not to resign. She always begged people not to resign, and then she said, okay, resign, called up Disraeli, which you like better anyway. And they all Gladstone went off to Italy for holiday for 5 months, in which he sulked and complained that they'd been beaten on the franchise. So the Tory government then came in a minority, and suddenly, as the Tory government comes in, there happens in the real history, really happens in these circumstances, what happens is one of those great agitations which seems to blow really out of nothing. It seems to come from nowhere. It doesn't really seem to have any particular logic to it. It certainly couldn't have been predicted by anyone. But a sudden, massive, great brush fire of agitation takes place on the subject again, as it had been in 1839, 1842, 1848. The subject was the question of reform. And so, if I was to ask the question, who'd heard of Gladstone and who'd heard of Disraeli, you always put up your hand if you've been honest. And if I ask the question, who has heard of Edmund Hughes, I think fewer of you would. I know this is, as I say, the elite, and I suspect
80 or 90% of you would at some time or other be able to say that you've heard of Edward Neal. But there will be some of you that will never come into this room tonight and have never heard of Edward Neal. Don't tell the person next to you. Some of you have heard. Now, he was an agitator by persuasion, a lawyer by profession, but an agitator in his activities. And he was the president of the Reform League, which had been formed in 1860 with a view to procuring universal suffrage. And no one had taken a great deal of notice of it. But as the 1860s went on, this is the interesting thing for us. 1864 is a very important year for all of us, because that was the timing of the First International under the influence of Karl Marx in London. There joined the General Council of the Reform League 6 trade unionists from all of them, by the way, on the General Council of the First International, or the three national most were all called George Hull, George Odger, George Icarius. 6 on there. And Marx writes to Engels, 1st of May 1865, the great success of the International is this: the League is all our work. I remember writing various similar letters around 1977, 1978. Think of the Anti-Nazi League. You just wrote it in letters, you didn't say it to anyone, because of course, you know, sitting on the platform of people like Neil Kinner. But the agitation changed in its nature and changed in its militancy and ferocity really from the time that these people joined, and the Reform League, which had been, when it was formed, a fairly irrelevant organisation, started to leap up in membership and in influence. It had, at the time we're talking about, July 1866, with this minority Tory administration in office, the Reform League had 58,000 members and 600 branches, which is more, perhaps that many more, than the Anti-Nazi League about 100 years later, or more than 100 years later. I'm not going to draw any other parallel between these two organizations, because they have none of us, so if anyone comes and say that they have any, whatever. Now, the plan was this, that they would have a demonstration in Hyde Park. That doesn't sound particularly amazing, does it? Really? In fact, what could be more boring? Going down to Hyde Park, especially if you've got a water Trafalgar Square, there's all of the bloody flag of the leaders of reform. But in those days, Hyde Park had more of a significance. Hyde Park was very much reserved for the upper classes, particularly those who rode horses. The whole area around the Serpentine was especially reserved for the carriages and horses and all the finery of the upper classes. And it was considered wrong for ordinary people to enter the park, or enter the park in an organised fashion, and to have political demonstrations and meetings was certainly something which was very much frowned on by the authorities. Also, it's probably worth mentioning that there is a significance that London has at that time, which was greater, as a matter of fact, than it was during the Charters, or even during the 1831-1832 legislation. London had 9 million people in 1866, which is approximately what it has today, perhaps a bit more, depending where you draw the boundaries around London. But considering the whole population of the country was only 21 million, there were more people living in London, more workers, as a matter of fact, in London, than there were in all the other boroughs and towns throughout the country. So there is an extra significance to the proposal to meet in Hyde Park in July 1866. I just read you a little bit here from the only report I can find. You don't find these reports of these demonstrations unless you go and look up the newspapers, which I haven't done. This is a report by Charles Bradlaugh's daughter. Bradlaugh was an atheist. He's the person who had difficulty getting out of the Commons because he was an atheist. And he was a member of the Reform League and a big campaigner for the vote. He was also a bourgeois, but we'll come to that in a minute. When the time came, procession after procession marched in orderly fashion to the park gates, and the meeting became a truly magnificent one, composed as it was mainly of respectable working men, thoroughly earnest in their desire for reform. They were not all Londoners either, you know. There were representative men from provinces, from Yorkshire, Lancashire, Plymouth, and other parts, men who had travelled many miles and undergone much fatigue to take part in the forbidden demonstration. From a brief notice of the meeting, which Mr. Bradlaugh wrote to the National Reformer, It appears that Mr. Beales and the committee reached the Marble Arch gate shortly after 7 o'clock, and leaving their vehicles, they went together to the police at the gate to demand admission. The police, however, meant mischief. One mounted man, number B32, named him, backed his horse right up to Mr. Beales and myself, and the example being followed by another mounted policeman, some confusion was created, and this was evidently the result desired by the police. The truncheons were all out, and some rough intimations given to those in front that mischief was met. On his demands being made and refused, Mr. Beales and his colleagues turned, as had been arranged, to lead the meeting by different routes to Trafalgar Square. Mr. Bradlaugh's division turned down Park Lane, but some of those on the outside, being irritated by the behaviour of the police, made an attack upon the railings of the park. Having read numerous accounts of this episode, I judged that the first railings fell partly accidentally. And the railing partly torn up in anger. When a few rails had given way, the idea of gaining ingress to the park in that manner spread through the crowd like a flash of light. And in a few minutes, many yards of railings were upon the ground, and the people leaping excitedly over them. Mr. Bradlaugh, strenuously adhering to the programme of his leader to carry the meeting to Trafalgar Square, set himself the difficult task of restraining the wild tumult, and preventing the match, and destroying the railings, and despoiling the flower beds, and after a little, although not before he himself had been knocked down, he was successful. The column resumed its orderly and peaceful march to Trafalgar Square, when, after much speechifying, we all went home. But the people who got in the park never home. In fact, they stayed there for 3 days and nights. And they did, sorry to say, it's terrible to have to report these things, but they did do some damage to the flower beds. All the things, places where the horses went along, you know, and the people felt they couldn't bring their horses in there. And there were more and more people going into the park, and more people saying they weren't going to leave the park until the government introduced a bill to introduce universal suffrage. And the place was full. 150,000, 200,000 people over those 3 days in July were in the park, and Beales went to see the Home Secretary, who was a man called Spencer Walpole. And he said to the Home Secretary, "We're in a terrible state. What do we do? We've tried the constables on them, we've tried the army on them, and still there's 150,000, 200,000 people. What are we going to do?" And Beales said, "Leave it to us. If you will allow us permission to go and have a meeting in the park, we will see that the demonstration is orderly dispersed." And you know what Spencer Walpole did? He cried. He said, "You saved my life, thank you very much. Please do that." Of course, they rushed off, and they did manage to disperse the park. The blowing of the Home Secretary was something which they remembered. It's important to remember the panic that this created. It wasn't just another demonstration, like we might think of the way we've been on so many demonstrations, just another one. Because it represented something so massive that was taking place throughout the country, the real demand for reform, the fact that a Tory administration had come in a minority after knocking out the Liberal administration and introduced a little bit of reform, the panic created by that meeting in Trafalgar Square was tremendous. Sir Stafford Northcote, who was the Secretary of State for India, wrote to his wife, "The mob are now trying it in Hyde Park, and perhaps, if they are defeated there, they will come on here to the House of Commons." And Frederick Harrison reports that clerks in business houses were issued with rifles which they could keep beside their desks all the way through the city of London. So the panic was tremendous, and the victory it was, even though the crowd had been dispersed, changed the political situation in such a way that strange agitations led by people who had no intention, seriously, of changing the political situation, changed the whole nature of the way in which politics was discussed, and what happened politically, not just in Britain over the next few months, but also what happened in other parts of the world for which Britain was responsible. For instance, the great agitation over the question of the Fenian prisoners, 1866, 1867, takes off from this date. The prosecution of Governor Eyre of Jamaica by the Jamaica Committee. The prosecution on the basis that he put down a rebellion in Jamaica and killed 586 black people just out of sheer torture and savagery. And he was prosecuted, atmosphere which he was prosecuted, not very successfully prosecuted, but nevertheless prosecuted. The atmosphere over all these things seemed to congeal. People sort of saw that what was going on in Jamaica and what was going on in Ireland and what was going on in refusing the vote of the people in this country, all part of one thing together. And from beginning of 1866, beginning of 1867, the tremendous agitation exploding all through the country. Some of it formal agitation, contained by those liberal politicians. John Bright spoke to 300,000 people in Glasgow. He came down and spoke to 200,000 people in Manchester, 150,000 people in Leeds. Massive, huge meeting. At least one of these people I read in the last I found out he couldn't hear what he said. You couldn't with any of those speeches hear what they said. They just came even though they knew they would hear. And also all the festivities that took place around the meeting, and the sub-meetings that took place as a result of that, so that the agitation went very, very deep. And during the period of this agitation, all echoes of the past, coming out of the past, things which they'd forgotten about, long since forgotten about, all kinds of terrible things. A delegate meeting called by the Reform League on the 27th of February 1867 passes this resolution: unless a satisfactory prospect is held out in Parliament of the working classes being universally enfranchised upon the principles of the Reform League, it will be necessary to consider the propriety of these classes adopting a universal cessation from labour until their political rights are conceded. A grand national holiday. The old chartists coming out of their caves and starting to mutter about the grand national holiday, the cessation of labour, the strike of 1839. All these things came leaping out, flying out of the past to hit these people that were sitting in Parliament right into their neck. And then, of course, following that, meeting up, that's introduces a bill. Disraeli introduces a bill. Disraeli introduces a bill which is very, very complicated. I'm not going to go into the complications of it. It's intended to be complicated, but it still keeps the franchise very, very restricted indeed. But it doesn't take into effect the fact that most workers, and particularly the poorer workers that didn't live in households, were paying their rates and rents together. Their rates and rents were compounded, and all those people were excluded from the franchise bill brought in by Disraeli. This wasn't satisfactory, of course, at all to the Reform League. All of the people that were agitating around these things throughout the country, they wanted no less than household suffrage. They didn't go for all the 5 points of the Charter, but they wanted household male suffrage, and they weren't going to accept anything else. And there was then another attack on Hyde Park in May, on May the 6th. And thank heavens that we do have books that do tell us what goes on, or what went on at that time. This book especially had a hell of a job to find it. In fact, I had to borrow it from Alistair Hatchett in the end. And if anyone sees this book anywhere, Before the Socialists, by Royden Harrison, who's speaking here on Monday, anyone sees that anywhere at all, if you see it, buy it, however much it is, and come and see it. Now, Royden Harrison describes the May the 6th, 1867 meeting in Hyde Park like this. At about 6 p.m, the Clerkenwell branch of the Reform League appeared at the gates of the park carrying a red flag surmounted with a cap of liberty. Half an hour later, there were between 100,000 and 150,000 people in the park. Now then, let me just say this, break off for this minute. What have been the preparations for this little park? On the announcement that there was going to be a meeting in the park, there was at once a proclamation issued by the government. Whereas it has been publicly announced that the meeting will be held in Hyde Park on Monday the 6th of May for the purpose of political discussion, and whereas the use of the park for the purpose of holding such meeting is not permitted, and interferes with the object for which Her Majesty has been pleased to open the park for the general enjoyment of our people, now all persons are hereby warned and admonished to abstain from attending, aiding, or taking part in any such meeting, or from entering the park with a view to attend, and or take part in such a meeting, S.H. Walpole, Home Office, Whitehall, May 1st, 1867. Right, that's the proclamation. And that proclamation is all over London, right over the weekend before Monday, May the 6th. And on top of the proclamation, that goes up on the Saturday. On the Sunday, there's a thing called the Yellow Programme, which goes on top of that. The Yellow Programme is it's the sheet of the Reform League, which says we will go to the park and we will demonstrate. So there's the counter to the proclamation. Then the army is called up and stationed all about the park. Then at Woolwich Arsenal, all the workers throughout the weekend are making stays for the special constables. All kinds of preparations are made for a mighty battle in Hyde Park in 1867. And I'll go back to see the significance. Half an hour later, there were between 100,000 and 150,000 people in the park. the leaders of the League entered with the sound of great cheering and proceeded to address the crowd from no fewer than 10 separate platforms. They tried to avoid giving full expression to their centre cry, but every reference to Beale and the League was saluted by prolonged applause, while mention of Walpole or the police was the signal for hisses and groans. From one platform, the call was given for a great national convention to prepare a reform bill. If their demands were rejected, 300,000 men should be brought into London from the north, and no man return until either the Commons passed the bill or until England had found its new Cromwell to turn out the men who had misrepresented the people in St. Stephen's. And Cromwell to you and I means to the ethnic, but in this it means that itch at the back of the neck. When someone talks about what style of Cromwell. Those who could not get near enough to hear the speeches listened to ballad singers without number, tell of the defeat of Walpole and the coming victory of reform. The police were hissed and a few stones were thrown, but crime was confined to a couple of pickpockets and 3 cases of thimble rigging, whatever that is. The fact is that there was that day the most tremendous victory inflicted by the people who went to the park against the proclamation and against what they would very well expect to be the most massive display of armed force. But it was one of those times in history, very few of them, but one of those times in history where the thing does determine. I mean, one can think of perhaps the demonstration before the 1905 revolution. It's not quite on this score. The Saltby Gate takes us down to, the more recognisable features of the Saltby Gate demonstration during the miners' strike in 72, an occasion where it does really matter whether you win a demonstration or whether you lose it. On that occasion, the government gave up without a fight. They pretended to be willing to fight, they wanted to put off what would happen, but they weren't prepared to have a fight on this issue because they sensed the strength of the enemy. And there was a man called Hodgkinson, who was a lawyer in Newark, who was bitterly opposed. He was the Tory MP for Newark. He was bitterly opposed to a franchise of any kind, but he introduced an amendment. He introduced it in one day. He brought an amendment saying, oh, let's get away with all this compounding. Let's just get on with the bill. The little amendment comes from Newark saying, we want to get rid of the compounding and have household suffrage. And yes, it's charged through before Gladstone knows what's going on here. What's going on here at Gladstone is they're passing a bill about 17 times more revolutionary than the bill which you tried to introduce last year, and these are the Tories in office and you're in opposition. Oh, I don't know what's going on. What shall I do? I better vote for it. Yes, you better. It unanimously goes through the House of Commons household suffrage, the same House of Commons which for 25 years has been holding up any little bit of this reform that has to come in, and it goes in because of the agitation outside. Indeed, it's the changes that take place in the circumstances of the time. I mean, the press changes. Like we say, the Sun in 1972 supported the miners. In 1984, they were absolutely against the miners. The Times in 1866, it is against all reason and all justice that motley crowds from all parts of the metropolis should take possession of Hyde Park and interfere with the enjoyments of those to whom Hyde Park more particularly belongs. 24th of July 1866, here is one sentence from the Times leader, 8th of May 1867, 2 days after the demonstration, Hyde Park really belongs to the whole British family. You see, still people say to you, oh, it's a free country, in a free country, you can go down to Hyde Park, can't you, and say what you like, as long as it's completely irrelevant and there aren't any police around, you can go down to Hyde Park and say what you like. But that, of course, that whole notion dates from this agitation, and the victory changes the press, it changes the nation, and it introduces universal suffrage. So the first lesson for the Trevelyanite both the Trevelyanite among bourgeois historians and also for the Trevelyanite who cluster about from time to time and pretend that they're revolutionaries, the first lesson is this. It is worthy of remark that not one of the main changes of that age was carried in Parliament without severe agitation out of doors. That's William Ewart Gladstone. There. And you won't believe that, will you? So I'll have to give you something from Marx. No important innovation, 1862. 1862, which is 5 years before, in fact. No important innovation, no decisive measure has ever been carried out in this country without pressure from without. So pressure from without, or out of doors, whatever you want to call it. The fact is, the reform of 1867 had nothing whatever to do with what was going on in the brain of William Ewart Gladstone, or where he put his hand when he makes his oratory, or what kind of novels Benjamin Disraeli could write, or any of their brilliance or intelligence. Nothing whatever to do with any of that. What it had to do with was that for the first time for nearly 20 years, the working class had organised itself around a very clear demand, and had impressed its strength upon the forces of reaction, the people that were in charge of the government at that time. And that was what happened. But of course, the story doesn't end there at all. That wasn't the end of the battle. Now, you might have thought it would be the end of the battle if you were living at that time, especially perhaps if you were a follower of Karl Marx. Because, and I always do this quote again because I know Jerry has lived so much that I simply can't resist it. However, we come now to the Chartist. This is Marx writing in the American Tribune, which is called the Tribune, in 1852, August 1852. We come now to the Chartist, the politically active portion of the British working class. The 6 points of the Charter which they contend for contain nothing but the demand of universal suffrage and of the conditions without which universal suffrage would be illusory to the working class, such as the ballot, claim of amendments, annual general elections, and so on. But universal would therefore be a far more socialistic measure than anything which has been honoured with that name on the continent. Its inevitable result here is the political supremacy of the working class. It wasn't only Marx, also Engels, and I don't know which one pulled up things are so similar that when there's Engels actually wrote this earlier. Universal suffrage in England, 2/3 of whose population consists of industrial proletarians, implies exclusive political power for the working class, together with all those revolutionary changes in social conditions intrinsic to that power. The 10 hours bill, which the workers are now calling for, is therefore quite different from the one which the Court of Exchequer just abrogated, and so on. I say it again, together with all those revolutionary changes in social conditions intrinsic to that power. Very embarrassing. Very embarrassing to read those things out now. But of course, when you're talking about the Chartist stuff in 1852, obviously it's always easy to look back and see what was going on at the time. That's the easiest thing. We can see now exactly what was happening in 1974, 1975. Clear! Absolutely obvious what was happening. Only trouble was none of us could understand it at all. Not one of us knew what was going on in those times, or detected it, or able to analyse it. This is the absolute ultimate elite of the, I'm talking about Central Committee members now, of what was going on in 1974, 1979. No idea at all, completely wrong, completely, everybody did keep writing in the highest journal saying how wrong they were. So at the time it's very difficult to tell, 1852, we were even completely clear then that the Chartist agitation had died down, or what the length of the downturn was facing them. Of course, in connection with the Chartists, if you win in Chartist agitation, working class agitation, working class strikes, if you'd won the vote in those circumstances, then of course you do start to talk about the possibility of all the dynamic social changes which that represented. In other words, if it comes out of a revolutionary upheaval, the vote, if it comes out of a revolutionary upheaval, then there's a prospect of revolution. But if it comes in different circumstances, it comes in this time, of course from pressure from without, but in quite different circumstances, the circumstances which were operating at the time of the Chartists. Men like Beales were not revolutionaries. They weren't even socialists. Hull wasn't a socialist. Ogden wasn't a socialist. The Carey, well, probably say he was a socialist, but probably not. So they weren't people who had any really conception of changing society through working class action. They were people in single issue campaign, prepared to put a lot of effort, a lot of courage into that campaign, but nevertheless a bourgeois-led movement, a movement led from the top by bourgeois people who wanted to contain their change within the existing structure of society. People like Beales and Howell and Odger are a million miles different from people like Hardy and Bronte O'Brien, and even Fergus O'Connor, that we're talking about in Skegness earlier this year, the Chartist leaders, the revolutionary physical force leaders. Although they came to physical force, although Marx and Engels had a lot to do with the way in which the Reform League was set up, the nature of the political position, the fact that they'd been in fact this long downturn, very little political strike activity, working class activity, meant that the introduction of these demands, because all the Chartist demands were effectively given in 1867 up to 1884. I mean, the Chartists never asked, unfortunately, for women's votes. That was another agitation which took place later. But all except the annual parliaments were granted by 1884, but not just by Gladstone, but also, well, in fact, both times by the Tories, they were granted. So the granting of them in circumstances in which they could be contained meant that the prediction that universal suffrage would lead immediately to political power for the working class and all the changes in social conditions with that involved was quite different in 1867, 1868. It wasn't just that Marx was wrong. It is this notion that somehow we go back and take these scriptures and write them in the scriptures as though we always refer, so-and-so said this, so it's true. Of course, people say things at different times, according to the notices of what's going on in the social circumstances of the time. And particularly, of course, Marx and Engels say things at different times, because they understood that what they said was, as a matter of fact, closely reflecting the class struggles of the time. And when the class has just been up and almost victorious, not just in Britain but all over Europe, in revolutionary upheaval, then you write in some quite different way. The way in which you write, in terms of the 1867, we formed the Reform League, we try and push and shove and push a bit in the Reform League, but nobody talks, when universal suffrage is granted, of revolutionary upheaval or political power for the working class or anything like that. In fact, quite the opposite happened. The leaders of the Reform League orientated quickly towards the grand old Liberal Party, as they called it. Hull and Odger became recruiting agents for the Liberal Party among the newly enfranchised workers, paid recruiting agents. The great Liberal capitalists and landlords, C.G. Glynn, James Stansfield, Salt, the Time-O Salt, Samuel Morley, huge employer. Morley employed 20,000 workers up and down the country. Great big Liberal employer. Paid Hull and Odger to go around the country recruiting newly enfranchised workers to the Liberal Party, to vote Liberal in the 1868 election. That's very well documented in that Lloyd and Harrison book as well. Engels slated them. You want a working class party. You don't want to go fiddling around after these Liberals. Marx laughed when Howells and Odger were defeated in the 1860-68 election. Laughed, roarious letter to Engels saying, I'm bloody glad. Colleagues on the International, by the way. First colleagues on the International. And people who he would treat as first colleagues on the International when they were with him, but when they were grovelling after the Liberal Party and going around quarrelling about their expenses, which is what they seem to be doing for most of that time, he would laugh when they were finally defeated in that election, although, of course, the Liberals won it. And in 1869, that is only 2 years after their success, the Reform League was wound up, and Lord Howe made a statement, "Continued agitation is bad for the country. What we need are more Liberal MPs." In 1873, you had a Tory government, which introduced these reforms, the further reforms of the country workers, which effectively meant universal male suffrage, effectively brought about all those things that the Charter stood up for, and were able to do it in such a way that they were capable of containing it. Now, it is 45 years still before women get the vote. It is, 1867, 33 years before a Labour Party is formed, an independent working class party. The whole of Engels's last series of articles, all the way through the late 1880s and the early 1890s, calling on the workers to form their own independent party founded upon the trade unions, urging them, pushing them. That doesn't happen. It takes the upturn in the 1890s after what he called the long winter sleep from 1848 all the way through to 1888. It takes an upturn among the rank and file workers in the 1890s, tremendous amount of strikes, in the 1890s in order to push finally people into forming independent working class based party, Labour Party, which starts coming into being in 1900. It's another 24 years before that party can form a minority government. It's another 80 years altogether in between 1873 and 1945 before they form a majority government. And it's quite clear, long before that if you take those quotes of Marx and Engels that I mentioned earlier, it's perfectly clear that if you just take them isolated, the way in which people do take quotes isolated, it is wrong to say that universal suffrage just leads automatically to the political power of the working class. What they have discussed at that time, what they started to discuss later, 1870s, 1880s, although never really came to terms with it as Lenin did, the power of the state machine of the capitalist class is stronger, isn't it? The power of the state is stronger than the power of that democracy. The power is not just in terms of the fact that they've got policemen and armies to put down people when they revolt. That's not the point. The point is also they have all the time the power of the state there, the power of their ability, the control over mental production, the prevailing ideas of the ruling class. All these things are stronger than just the level of democracy which leads to voting through Parliament. Lenin sums up when he comes now to discuss it. To come on to Lenin even, I do think that some of the early stuff in State of Revolution, when he selects the quotations of Marx and Engels, although it's beautifully done, I do think it's selected. I think he could leave that because it wasn't of any use to him for his purposes to write this in the summer of 1917, but it does leave out the fact that for really many, many years, Marx and particularly Engels were not very, very interested in what was going on in the Reform League, in the formation of an independent party, in the parliamentary politics of the time. Very, very interested and always pushing at it. But he comes to the point again. Take any parliamentary country, from America to Switzerland, from France to England, Norway and so forth. In these countries, the actual work of the state is done behind the scenes and is carried on by the departments, chancelleries and general staffs. Parliament itself is given up to talk for the special purpose of fooling the common people. That's absolutely exactly describes the position today. The call of the Paris Commune to replace the Parliament, the Parliament with working executive bodies, as it exposes the fact that the Parliament, what you elect, is not power to change social conditions. You elect people to talk about changing social conditions, and then to prove by their talking that they can't do even what they talk about. The state, therefore, it follows from all of this that however great the reform, however great the agitation that leads to the reform, unless the agitation that leads to the reform breaks the state machinery which is capable of holding that reform and containing it, unless it's able to do that, then it will subside again. And whatever the reform is, even if it extends the voting, even if you have annual parliaments, even if you took every aspect of changing the democratic process, the ultimate beautiful Rolls-Royce type of democracy you could imagine, however great it is, as long as the state remains intact, as long as the economics, if you like, economic power resides in the hands of one class and the state around it in order to uphold that class, then that reform will be contained in some way. It will be contained and turned, in fact, to people's advantages. The advantage of the class. They'll use, as they're constantly using today, the notion that it's a democracy, that you've elected us to do these things, that you've elected us to introduce a poll tax, you've elected us to further privatize, you've elected us to do these things. They use the ability to control the minds of people and to limit their aspirations between just one or two parties in the operation. They use that ability in order to increase their power and to substantiate to make more substantial their control. That's all very important, but it's also important to realise this, that you go back to it again, if you like those two caricatures I made at the beginning, the caricature of the bourgeois historian and the caricature of the person who says all this is quite irrelevant to the revolutionary struggle.
Well, just this other quote from him, which I also think is very important. The way out of parliamentarism is the way he puts it. The way out of parliamentarism is not, of course, the abolition of the representative institutions and the electoral principle, but the conversion of the representative institutions from mere talking shops into working bodies. Very important, because people somehow get so sick of the democracy, so sick of Thatcher telling us that she's democratically elected, that they're inclined to say, as we saw some people saying during the election, that all this really is of no significance to democracy, it's absolutely absurd, it's a complete and utter sham, it's absolutely irrelevant. These are the things, don't forget, these are the things which German communists said in 1831, 1832, after Hitler our turn, the social fascists, the people who are, miserable, people who are interested in democracy when it's plainly not a democracy, it's all a sham, we don't want anything to do with it, we're not going to have any electoral pact to these people or any other pact of any kind, whatever. Those things are extremely dangerous. Socialism doesn't destroy the representative institutions. The whole of this little pamphlet, the wonderful pamphlet it is, the whole of this little pamphlet is not, all the way through it keeps coming up. And it's not destroying the representative institutions, not destroying the electoral idea, the idea of election, on the contrary, reinforcing it. Full of democracy, full and proper democracy, in which people can properly be seen to be in charge of what happens after they've voted people in, as well as they are in their ability to vote. These are the things that Lenin's constantly talking about. Capitalism, after all, is a system which is fundamentally undemocratic. And that seems to be a central part of the way in which it operates. It's a hierarchical, bureaucratic system. It depends on people not being involved in that decision. And therefore there are all kinds of contradictions thrown up in a capitalist democracy. They're able to contain it. They're able to use it for its own purposes. But the fact that it was established, and the fact that it was established against their will, and the fact that does still involve some kind of a democracy, does involve it all the time in awkward contradictions which open cracks. And they open cracks for us in the society. They get into those cracks, especially in times when the general class struggle seems to be going down. These things, all kinds, it's impossible to predict how they happen, but all kinds of contradictions arise from the fact that people believe they have certain rights. They have certain democratic things which they've won over the years through their struggle. They didn't even know about the struggle which they fought, but they felt somehow that they've achieved this, and when these things are taken away from them, or interfered with them in any way, or they feel that people have gone over the bounds of fairness, then all kinds of possibilities open up. So I just sum up to say like this: it is not true that we want to vote on the brilliance of Glasgow is ready. We want to vote because our forebears, or whatever you want to call them, people who come from our tradition a long time ago, working class people, defied the law, broke the law, went there, held a demonstration, and demanded that they got the vote, and they got it. That's why we got it. You never get any change, whatever. Any change in our advantage, of any kind, whatever, unless you get that pressure from the right. But it is also not true that universal suffrage brings political power to the working class. The ruling class retains that power as long as they retain the wealth. And therefore, of course, the capitalist democracy is a sham democracy. It's not a proper democracy. But as I say, and I'll just say it again, we, in order to have the power to break that state machine, we have all the time to look and see what's going on among people who don't agree with us. We can't do it on our own. You think, occasionally, you come, once a year, just about, or twice a year actually, you get in a meeting where you think, God, we could do it on our own. Look at all these people here. I mean, we could go and take the whole balls off the system. We could really tear it aside if we just went out. All the anger that's pent up here, all the knowledge, all the intelligence, the laughter, all that together, take it all, we can go and smash the system down. And you think of yourself, no, not really as easy as that. A couple of policemen have probably done us that. It's very good. We can't do it on our own. We're How many members do you know were living in London 80 years ago? I can mention two, and now to be quite confident of two. But actually, very confident one lives in London, John Connolly. So I know that Fred Edmonds is in Manchester. So that's two. I know two. I don't know many others that were around. Socialists, I mean, real revolutionary socialists. There were a few, of course, there were a few, but not really one of those. Very, 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 very few people who were socialists in 1867, and still they managed getting in that crack and push the government back and for a time to change the atmosphere. Now, it seems to me this, that there are many more of us, and there are always all kinds of different cracks happening all the time. It isn't true. If it really felt that was true, there certainly wouldn't be so many people in this room. That they've got complete control of everything that goes on. Any system divided in the way in which our system of society is divided is going to throw up revolt. And those revolts are not going to be ordained or laid down in the way in which we want them to be laid down. They may be after things which seem quite absurd and ridiculous to us who understand the way in which the capitalist state is able to control us. But nevertheless, those things will happen. They'll break out, they'll shift. And when they break out and shift, please remember what happened in the Reform League, what happened in 1867. Very, very important. Many ways, in our time, the time we're living now, in the time of downturn, these things in many ways are as important to remember as the periods of the great upheavals in 1839 and 1972 and periods like that. You have to remember that in what's called downturn, things break and shift and change with amazing speed, and they often relate to the way in which the working class people feel that their rights, their fairnesses, have somehow been taken away from them. We need to be able to have the capacity to intervene in all those things, intervene in such a way that people trust us, and so that we can build around us in those circumstances, so that unless we can do that, as we can understand that these are not things laid out in formulas, or things that are going on, as we get the trust. And when those kind of movements develop, then we'll never ever get the power to do the thing that we know we all have to do, which is to smash that state machine and replace it with something entirely different.